Shalom. Given how better informed we are now about just how flighty YouTube is about certain terms, this seemed like the perfect opportunity to talk about Jews. Or rather, to talk about the Muh J00z issue coming from the far right, and conspiracy theorists and other general nutters that you run into far more often online, but does make you wonder how many people are harbouring these thoughts behind the scenes. So, let's talk about the Jews. But why? Why do I want to talk about this? Yeah, just when I'm enjoying sweater weather, why do I want to dig up such a contentious topic? Well, whenever my videos intersect with any sort of far right or crazy conspiracy nonsense, I get flooded with comments. Overwhelmingly anti-Semitic comments. Now, I've been accused of being just about every racial subtype on the planet. I don't know. One of those kind of generic faces, I guess, even though I'm pretty much as white as it gets. Possibly with the exception of Polynesian. But the most common thing that I get accused of being is Jewish. I'm guessing it's the nose. I've got quite a big nose. Slightly hooked, I guess. Maybe that's it. But I've been called everything, but Jew comes up a lot. Specifically, Khazarian, which is a weird sub-conspiracy about the Jews, that most Jews aren't actually proper Jews. We'll come back to that in a bit, I suppose. But it's just weird. So I thought it was maybe time to kind of tackle head-on some of the issues and things, because yeah, I've got a lot of Jewish friends, and unlike a lot of racism, anti-Semitism seems to be relatively overt and obvious, and I see them dealing with it all the time. And I have family history that relates to some of the nastier Nazi camps. There goes my monetization. I said Nazi. Oops, I said it twice. Oops. Anyway, so it's a topic I relate to through my friends, through my family history, and through these constant bizarre, I guess, accusations that I'm Jewish. Though I don't see anything bad in that, and even the Khazarian allegation is kind of backhandedly a compliment in a way. But yeah, the Jews have been subject to a lot of persecution and trouble down centuries, down millennia, and this is often cited by anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists as an idea as to why this is somehow justified, that the fact that they've been treated like shit throughout history somehow means there must be something going on, you know, no smoke without fire sort of argument. So where does all this persecution come from, and what's the kind of easiest explanation for a lot of the things that conspiracy theorists point at? Well, like most things, it goes back to religion, because religion is fucking insufferable. And Judaism combines ethnicity and religion to an extent. It's not particularly a proselytizing religion. It doesn't necessarily seek out to convert people or to change them to its faith. I mean, you might adopt it for reasons of marriage and so on, but that's pretty much it. It's a bit odd in not being a particularly evangelical faith. That means it's combined ethnicity and religion and ideology to a lesser extent, which means that if you're Jewish, you kind of automatically fulfill two criteria for discrimination at once: religious discrimination and racial discrimination, and I think that's a big part of it. But it goes back to religion and the persecutions that religions dole out to each other. Going right the way back to the Greek and Roman gods, there was an imposition within the Greek Hellenistic empires against Judaism, probably because while pantheistic pagan religions tend to be quite tolerant, I think that there's a certain degree of limit to that. If your religious belief is completely alien to theirs. If you're seen as a political bloc or insurgents or a conquered people, then you want to try and convert them over to you. If we look at pre-Christian Europe, you can see that the same kinds of pantheons show up over and over and over again. The Norse pantheon, you have Odin in the northern countries, he becomes Wotan in the Germanic countries, and there are parallels between pantheistic gods that overlap, so there's kind of a common language there between those old pantheons. You don't get that if you have a monotheistic religion, claiming that there's one god that's not the equivalent to any of the others. It's not like king of the gods, it's the only god and all of your gods are false. You know, that rubs people the wrong way and tends to lead to persecution. And, you know, the boot has been on the other foot plenty of times throughout history. So we can see that this isn't a uniquely Jewish problem, but rather we can understand where that comes from as a minority, non-evangelical, monotheistic religion, why that would be a problem in paganistic, polytheistic empires. So there's that. And there was persecution under the Romans to an extent, because again, this was an empire, this was kind of the far-flung parts of the empire. They wanted to maintain control, and there was a lot of resistance from other religious groups, including the Jewish people. So we can see and understand that. Basically, they've been a minority, an ethnic and a religious minority everywhere that they've been, even going back to Babylon, from which a lot of Judeo-Christian mythology was hijacked. But it really kicked into high gear with the advent of Christianity, because supposedly, you know, it's the Jews and their high priests and so forth that killed Christ, that killed God. And if your religion is tied in intimately to the divinity of your deity that came down to earth and then they got killed, that's going to create a certain amount of hostility. And, you know, up until relatively recently, that, you know, animal sacrifice and so on was continuing under the Jewish tradition. But a lot of this persecution really kicked off with the advent of Christianity, which is and was a viciously evangelical religion. In its earlier days, much more like Islam in a lot of ways, in the way that it would persecute and kill people. Well, not necessarily in its early days, but once it was established and had some power. And it's because of that that we get things like the blood libel, the supposed human sacrifices that are supposedly still engaged in by Jewish communities for various things. That's kind of an early version of the satanic panic. You know, someone would go missing, someone would disappear, someone would get murdered, and you needed someone to blame. And here was this ghettoized, ethno-religious minority who seemed to have alien beliefs, who rejected your God. You know, what was the difference between that and worshipping Satan or engaging in witchcraft? Things that only got further confused by Kabbalism and ceremonial ritual Western magic, of course. So while there was nothing to it, there was a useful scapegoat here. So they would try to force conversions. If they couldn't convert people, they would kill them. There were massacres, the pogroms during the Crusades. Things got hyped and heightened up. Yeah, it all comes down to scapegoating. I mean, during the Black Death, there was a huge amount of scapegoating as well. You know, why were people dying of this mysterious disease? Well, let's blame the convenient ethno-religious minority. And that is the way it seems to have been throughout history. If we look to Islam, it wasn't always anti-Semitic. There seemed to be kind of a common cause before Islam really gained a huge amount of power, even alliances. But then once Islam began to get power, then things started to change, but it still wasn't necessarily virulently anti-Semitic. The Islamic Golden Age was built on a tolerance of other religions, particularly Judaism, within Islamic cities, and that's what led to the cosmopolitanism and the great advances in culture and science and so on that were then lost at the end of the Islamic Golden Age as the the clerics, the priests, and so on began really exercising their power all over again. Then the Jews first became an oppressed minority, dhimmis, which is a phrase you'll often see the far right bandying about for anyone who is, or what they refer to as a quisling, I guess, surrendering to the forces of Islam, whatever. The dhimmis were a persecuted minority, but also a protected minority. Basically, you had abrogated rights, and you had to pay a tax, but you were allowed to live, and you did have a certain amount of protection and so on within the Islamic State. Not perfect, but not really a pogrom exactly. But then things gradually got worse and worse and worse because they were just consistently rejecting Islam. Islam is viciously evangelical in the way that Christianity was, and so again you start to get murders and scapegoating and conspiracy theories and all the rest of it. Then we get to the political scapegoating of the 20th century. Everyone knows about the Nazis, of course, and they had a racial and spiritual ideology which kind of brought together certain occult beliefs, conspiratorial beliefs, bad science on race, which was one of their reasons for targeting the Jews. The ground had been sown rather nicely with Lutheranism in Germany, which was virulently anti-Semitic even before the Nazis ever showed up. So bring in the sort of stabbed in the back idea for why the Germans lost World War I with the religious persecution of the Jews, all the conspiracy theories and the occult nonsense, and you have a kind of a perfect storm of hatred, which let itself out upon the Jewish people in the way in which we're all familiar. The atrocity of the Holocaust and the nature of the Nazi war machine and death machine tends to overshadow other issues for Jews in the 20th century. When Britain controlled Israel, there was Jewish terrorism and so on. We didn't treat them particularly well either. In Tsarist Russia, they were ghettoized and persecuted. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a notorious conspiracy tract, came out in 1903 in Russia, so prior to the revolution. When the communists took power, things were better for a while, but then later on, particularly under Stalin, who also cracked down on the Orthodox Church before he came to an accommodation with them, there was still persecution. Very few synagogues were allowed to remain open. Those that were under constant police watch, and the Soviet Union, again particularly under Stalin, took a virulently anti-Zionist stance. They didn't want a Jewish state, they didn't want a religious state. And so the persecution ramped up and a lot of Russian Jews left. Just returning briefly to the Holocaust. You can quibble over exact numbers, I guess, but denying that it ever happened seems to me to be absurd. It was a systemized, recorded attempt to destroy a people. Now, it does tend to overshadow that plenty of other people were killed: political opponents, homosexuals, gypsies, communists. But that 6 million figure appears to be right, and there's rarely been anything quite like it. That is what a genocide really looks like. And a lot else in the 20th century and into the 21st all stems from that singular atrocity. I mean, the existence of Israel is in large part to do with that. Yeah, that's a big part of the reason why a Jewish state was established, why it was handed over. I don't know that having it in the Middle East, surrounded by Islamic states, was necessarily a good idea. I don't see why the US couldn't have given them Florida or something. After all, the Mormons have Utah. That may have been a better idea, a lot more secure and safe for everybody, but this is the situation that we find ourselves in. I mentioned a personal connection. I've talked about it before, but my grandfather was part of the regiment that liberated Belsen-Bergen, which was a work camp and a prisoner camp, and also held a lot of Jewish people. And he never really talked about it, but I've been doing some research and looking through a few of his artifacts and so on. He was given a carved piece of wood from the camp by the people who were imprisoned there as thanks for liberating them. It was during the liberation of Belsen-Bergen that a special diet to aid people against famine and to help them recover from starvation was created. They flamethrowered the camp. They burned it down to control disease and get rid of pests, and just because they were so outraged and disgusted by what they saw there. And it so horrified him, I think, that he never really talked about it, but I've been tracking down his forces records and things, and I just get more and more horrified the more I see, really. So I think it's appropriate that so much has been affected by the atrocity of the Holocaust and the Nazis. So if you're a persecuted people like the Jews, what do you do in response to this, in response to centuries of being targeted and hated, loathed, despised, people wanting to destroy you, get rid of you, scapegoating you for everything? The trouble is, the responses that the Jewish community has made, while they're rational and they make sense, and they have a good explanation for why they are the way they are, they have only fed the current conspiracy theories. Yeah, if you're a people that's constantly on the move, that's constantly needing to resettle, make a new life for yourself, you're going to value education, you're going to value intelligence. And there's a strong cultural value in the Jewish community for education. A lot of pressure to be a doctor or a lawyer or these kind of significant, influential positions, because they always have value wherever you go, right? We see similar cultural pressures in the South Asian community, especially when they've moved to other countries, in the Asian community, but we don't treat that the same way. It's a racial stereotype, but it's one that has a certain degree of accuracy to it. But for some reason, when the Jewish people seek to educate themselves, better themselves, to become important and influential through education, through learning, which is another cultural value, we see that as bad or wrong or sinister, which is just peculiar. I don't see why anyone feels that way. Why might the Jewish people be, generally speaking, Israel notwithstanding, internationalist? Why might they be anti-nationalist? Why might they want to see more of a global community and a set of laws and protections and rights to be founded internationally around the globe? Well, because they've been persecuted, right? And because they've been chased out of everywhere. They've seen how they get scapegoated, how nationalism can hurt them. So it would only make sense as a people to come to value internationalism. And that extends to, along with the education thing, that extends to international banking and so on, which is somehow seen as some sort of sinister Jewish plot, when really it's more about how do you secure your finances, how do you keep them safe from pogroms and political persecution and so on. Why not? And if you're going to be persecuted, it's hard not to ghettoise, to come together with people who share your values for mutual protection and understanding, to get a break from being persecuted. And why might the people who have been targeted by propaganda and hatred throughout their history get involved in the media, get involved in newspapers and film and television and so on? Well, to counter that, right? To offer a counterpoint and to be in a position to work against it. There's a far simpler explanation for all of these allegations than there's a Jewish conspiracy to undermine the West. They're just acting in their own self-interest, and that actually quite often that works for the betterment of all of us. None of this is to say that there isn't valid criticism. Circumcision is barbaric, right? Israel, if there are any people on earth who should know better than to engage in the kinds of persecution that Israel does, it's the Jewish people. And Israel is virulently nationalistic as a whole, but it is still democratic, it is still fairly liberal, it is still fairly Western, and we should celebrate that, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't be able to criticise them. And a big problem that I think we do run into is that we seem to feel that we can't criticize the conduct of Israel without being accused of anti-Semitism. There needs to be an understanding and a separation, and an explicit separation, between hatred for the Jewish people and distaste for certain policies or governments or politicians within Israel itself. But it's an easy dig if someone criticizes Israel for something to call them anti-Semitic or whatever, to confuse genuine anti-Zionism with the dog whistle anti-Zionism, which is actually anti-Semitism. So there's plenty of reasons to be concerned and critical, even especially because of Jewish history. But there's an easy out for a lot of people when they're targeted for criticism, if they happen to be of Jewish ancestry, in that they can just shout anti-Semitism. We see the same thing in plenty of other places with other minority communities. And it's incumbent on both the criticizer and the criticized to make the distinction between the two. Of course no one will, because it's easier not to. So that brings us back to the conspiracy nonsense and the accusation that I'm somehow a Khazarian Jew. The Khazarian theory is a pseudoscientific conspiracy theory about the ancestry of the Ashkenazis, who supposedly aren't Jews, but come from a mass conversion of the Turkic Khazars. There is no genetic evidence of this. So basically, they get to accuse me of being Jewish, but then of not even being an authentic actual Jew, but being an usurper Jew. So bizarre.
They're just jealous because I have big tits and an Ashkenazi IQ.
Yes, that's what it is.
Yeah.
You got it.
I'm going to tell you.
And the current conspiracy theories are all about supposedly undermining the morals and the character and the sort of national culture and self-belief of the white West, of Western civilization and so on, which is just absurd. It's just an attempt to target them. There's no evidence for any of it. As we've covered, there are better explanations for all of this. So anti-Semitism and Jewish hatred, it's disappointing to constantly see this as an accusation, because I don't see it as an accusation, I see it as largely meaningless. And it just confuses and prevents the genuine criticisms of Israel from ever being made. And that's a shame. Metzuyan.